Welcome back, everybody. I am very excited to be coming to you today with another series review, which I haven't done in a minute here on this channel. So today I am very excited to be talking about All the Wrong Questions by Lemony Snicket, which is the prequel series to a series of unfortunate events. So All the Wrong Questions is a series of 4 books. Book 1 is called Who Could That Be at This Hour? Book 2 is called When Did You See Her Last? Book 3 is Shouldn't You Be in School? And Book 4 is Why Is This Night Different from All Other Nights? So as the title of the series implies, it is all the wrong questions, and so every single title is a different question. So as I said, this is a prequel series to a series of unfortunate events, and it follows a young Lemony Snicket as he begins his apprenticeship. This apprenticeship takes him to a small town called Stained by the Sea, which is known for its lucrative ink business, but ever since they drained the sea away to try to get at the ink-making octopi, and it not working, the town is slowly dying out. A lot of people are leaving, a lot of businesses are closing, and him and his mentor are assigned to what seems to be a really innocuous minor case of a theft, but the more that they dig into it, or more specifically, the more that Lemony digs into it, the more that he starts to realize that there is something decidedly more complicated and more sinister going on in this town. So as Lemony tries to solve this case, and from this case, all of different series of cases that arise from the things that he discovers in the first case, he is increasingly concerned with the case that his sister is working on back in the city that he has left, especially because the implication is that he should be there with her at this point, and yet he is still here and Stained by the Sea. The series is filled with Easter eggs for fans of the original series, which is what I grew up with. I vividly remember reading A Series of Unfortunate Events when I was 13, about to enter high school, and it remains one of my favorite adolescent series that I've read, and so it was really wonderful to be able to return to this world and to at least one of these characters, our beloved narrator from the original series, and to get his backstory. And even if you are not necessarily a fan of the original series, or if you've not read them, this is a really good mystery and a really good story in its own right. And of course, characteristically very Lemony Snicket, as it is darkly funny, it's very clever, it's very witty, while also being surprisingly, or probably not very surprisingly if you were familiar with his work, very sentimental and dark and tragic and really heartfelt, while also being clever and witty and rather absurd at certain points. So as usual, I'm going to start with my ratings for 5 different categories. When I rate books, I try to look at character, plot, the writing style, the setting and immersion, and the pacing. So I'm going to go over my ratings for the entire series. I'm not going to go book by book, but generally speaking, what I think of each of those categories for the series as a whole. Try to keep it spoiler-free, and then once I have wrapped up with those thoughts, then I'll move into some more in-depth thoughts that include spoilers. So starting off strong with character, I gave this a full star. The characters in the series are very caricature-y. They tend to fill these certain tropes and these certain roles, but the more time that you spend with them, the more you realize how actually complex and complicated they are, how akin to real people they are. And of course, as the series progresses, each of these characters becomes increasingly more layered, in particular, Lemony Snicket himself. And speaking of, I found it very, very easy to fall back into the rhythm of Lemony Snicket's voice, but it was really fun getting to get this first-person narrative from him. Even though we get that in A Series of Unfortunate Events, this is a lot more personal because it is his story. He is not tracking the story of the Baudelaire orphans anymore. He is now telling his own story. So it was really fun to be in his head and to hear his thoughts and his internalization as a young narrator. I also really loved the teamwork element here. Very similar to me, at least as far as how I felt about it, to The Mysterious Benedict Society, which is one of my absolute favorite stories from when I was about the same age. I think I read that one a little bit earlier, but still a staple of my childhood and still one of my favorite things I've read to this day. But in the same way that Mysterious Benedict Society really emphasized teamwork, I felt a lot of that same sentiment here in All the Wrong Questions. We get this really good mix of Snicket learning how to do things on his own, as well as learning to rely on the friends that he has made, or his associates, as he begins to call them. But it really is a lovely study in ensemble work, and it does have a really good ensemble cast. Not too large, pretty easy to keep track of who is who, again, because they are so caricature and each of them fills a particular trope and role, but it's a very fun cast of characters to look at, especially through young Lemony Snicket's eyes. So yeah, full star for me on character. character. For plot, I gave this 3/4 of a star. Sometimes I felt like the plot was a bit all over the place, but not necessarily overwhelmingly so. It was more that we were laying the groundwork for the overall mystery, and so some pieces sometimes kind of seemed to come out of left field, but it did all click together in the end. Overall, this follows a very classic mystery style, but it's still done in a way where it is surprising and fun to read. So not necessarily the most like incredibly original plot or plot structure that I've seen, but I did really enjoy it overall. Next is the writing style, and I obviously gave this a full star. This is probably my favorite element of the series for me, besides character at least. Snicket is so clever and so witty, while also managing to be incredibly sincere and so tragic at the same time. There are so many lines that I had to just pause and sit with, which I will get into in the spoiler-filled thoughts because I don't want to spoil anything, but it was Snicket's voice in particular, the character, the narrator, not necessarily the author because we know it's a pseudonym, but the voice of Lemony Snicket was my favorite thing probably about reading this. There were also multiple times that I would laugh out loud at this, or at least snicker a little bit. I really enjoyed how witty and how funny it was, even though the story itself was rather drastic. There was a lot of really dark, difficult things going on, and obviously we are following this really sinister plot in this town, and so a lot of really awful things happen, but at the same time, the way that it is narrated is so much fun. And again, it's done in a way where you can laugh out loud, but you will also have those moments where you will have to just sit with what's happening for a second because it does feel so heavy. And so there's a really good balance of that. But yeah, this did make me laugh out loud quite a bit. And again, while I was used to Snicket's voice from the original series, I loved the take here because we got to see so much more of his internalization. And of course, we're getting this from a semi-retrospective viewpoint, but he does still seem to be very young in the series here. So it's not necessarily that he's looking back on it as an adult. It is like he is telling of his experience while he is still a kid. And so it's really fun to get that element of characterization, especially if you're a fan of the original series. But even if not, because he was such a great character, I think the internalization of his character really made for the great storytelling here. Next is going to be setting and immersion. I gave this 3/4 of a star as well. I really enjoyed Stained by the Sea as a setting. It was one of those settings where it feels like very stereotypical backdrop to a mystery, but the more that you explore it, the more interesting it becomes. And I think there were some times where I felt the setting felt a little tacked on. In particular, I think of in book 3 where all of a sudden we're at a school, and while obviously it shouldn't be surprised that there's a school in this town, just the way that it's set up kind of feels like, okay, now we're adding another backdrop to the backdrop that already exists. And again, not that that's a bad thing, but sometimes it felt a little out of nowhere for me. But again, I think that's maybe just my reaction to it as a reader. I don't think it's poor writing in that sense. And while the town didn't necessarily feel like an active character in the story, it did have a lot of personality that added a lot of depth to the story that was unfolding within its city limits, as well as adding a lot to the overall atmosphere of the story. The setting and the narration just worked really well together to create the atmosphere, and so I did really appreciate that about the immersiveness of this. And in true Snicket style, we're not really sure exactly where we're at in the world. We're not exactly sure what time period it is. It feels very old-fashioned, but when, kind of up in the air, so I liked the ambiguity of that as well. And I also want to add a note here about how much the illustrations added to the ambiance, and I loved that about the original series as well, so I liked that we kept this in this series here. And let me see if I can find a good one to show you without spoiling anything. I'm going to go ahead and look in book 1. I feel like that's the best place to look for that. We'll start right off at the beginning here, so this is before even the first page, and here is the illustration. Maybe a little hard to see with the camera, but it's just a really fun kind of cartoony style that adds to the fact that we are getting a young Snicket's perspective, but at the same time you get that also kind of lurking sinister feeling from the way that the illustrations are done. So I really enjoyed that. Well done to Seth, the illustrator for these books. And then finally, I'm going to talk about pacing, and I also gave this 3/4 of a star. I liked that each book had exactly 13 chapters. It felt like we were setting expectations, so I knew the rhythm that we were getting into with each book. There were some pieces that I think felt a little repetitive here and there, but again, it did fit into the overall rhythm of the story. And I always found myself struggling a little bit at the beginning of each book as we got into the next leg of the mystery, and I didn't necessarily always feel the urgency, but that was always remedied within the first handful of chapters. It didn't take long to kind of get into the swing of the newest element of the overall mystery that's happening across all 4 books. So again, I think this is maybe just more me as a reader getting into the swing of it or getting used to the setup of each installment over anything objectively wrong with the writing itself. Not that a 3/4 star is a bad rating for this category at all, but there are just a few elements that maybe felt a little bit slower or a little bit more repetitive to me, but on the whole, really good pacing across the board. And this is really easy for me to rate overall because I gave each book the exact same score. So books 1 through 4 all got a 4.25 for me. But the more that I think about it and the more that I sit with it, I do think the series as a whole is kind of creeping up to a 4.5 for me. I don't know if that makes sense at all, but I do feel like it is the entire story. When I look at all 4 books together, that I just love the entire thing, and that rating, at least based on my own feelings about the story, it is kind of creeping up to a 4.5, but if I look at each book individually, it sits more at a 4.25 for me. So I'm going to say a 4.25, but I ended up being a lot more attached to these characters and to the story than I was expecting to be. If you're a fan of the original A Series of Unfortunate Events, if you enjoy a good creative simile and a good snarky narrator that's wise beyond their years, or if you're simply looking for a worthwhile and unique middle grade mystery to read, I cannot recommend All the Wrong Questions enough. So now I'm going to pause for a second and give you a second to click away if you don't want any spoilers, but from here on out, I am going to give more in-depth commentary, at least in-depth for me, about the series as a whole and why it mattered so much to me, and going into spoilers. So I want to start off with my biggest critique. I want to get that out of the way first. The whole bombinating beast being a real thing, I really didn't like. Wasn't a huge fan of that. I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it. Like, my initial reaction is that I didn't enjoy it, but I can see why we made that choice. It works in the story world, but at the same time, it felt kind of out of left field for me because it was such a fantastic kind of thing. And while that does happen in the original series, I think this one, because we were emphasizing so much that it's a mythological creature, for it to just like appear and be this big monster felt a little strange to me. So not my favorite creative choice, but that's just me. To each their own, I suppose, which is funny for me because usually I love a good, fantastic monster, but it just felt a little weird for this series. But moving on, I want to talk about my absolute favorite thing of the series, and that was the writing. I cannot get over the writing. So I want to share a few quotes that really, really stood out to me, and I'm going to find them really quickly. I didn't start keeping track of the quotes that stood out to me until book 3. All of the books except for book 1 are from the library. I've had book 1 on my bookshelf forever, but it meant I couldn't mark them up, and so I didn't think to start writing them down or taking pictures of the pages until I got to book 3. So there's quite a few good quotes from book 1 and 2 as well, but I'm going to look predominantly at book 3 and 4 for the quotes that stood out to me. From book 3, which is Shouldn't You Be in School, I love the scene where, I can't remember where they're driving to at this point, but Cleo and Jake are in the front seat, and Cleo says, "Don't distract the driver, Hicks." And then it says, "But she was smiling. I smiled too. It is good to see people happy with one another. It is a glimpse of a world in which everyone is that way. A happy world might be boring," I told myself, but watching Jake grin at Cleo, grinning at Jake, grinning at Cleo, and back again, I thought it was worth the risk. And considering how silly this series can be at some times, there really were a few quotes that were like that, where it really emphasized the importance of friendships, of relationships, and we took a moment to pause in the midst of all the chaos going on and really look at the heart behind the story. And it was little quotes like that that were just sprinkled throughout that I really, really loved, because it was this really lovely way to look at the importance of teamwork and of being a part of something that Snicket is coming to realize for himself as the story progresses. And then I'm going to go ahead and move on to book 4 for a couple of the last quotes here. So book 4, this was, "Why is this night different from all the other nights?" And I am looking specifically at a quote on page 131, so I'm going to flip to that real fast. And I picked this one just because I loved the similes throughout this entire series. That's one of my favorite things about Snicket's writing, is his unique similes, but particularly this one really stood out to me. He says, "I stood in the corridor feeling like an angry pebble. It didn't matter where I rolled off to. The mystery and treachery of the world continued, and a pebble like me could get angry over anything it liked, and it wouldn't do any good." And I love that, because what a silly image, right? I felt like an angry pebble that had been kicked. But the fact that it emphasizes how small he feels in that moment, especially considering that we are about to hit the end of the series, this whole mess that they've been working through, we are about to hit the climax of. And so emphasizing that feeling of smallness in the face of treachery, I really liked the way that he did that. And this one, I can't remember what page number this is, but I have it written down here. Snicket says, "It might not be enough to defeat the evil aboard the Thistle of the Valley, I thought, but it is better to fail among friends." Love that quote. It's just great. Kind of speaks for itself. And then finally, a couple more things that I want to look at. This one's on page 179. The way that he describes this really, really struck me. So he finally has this confrontation with Hangfire, and they're standing in the train car, and Ellington is supposedly dead behind them. Not actually, which we know. But, you know, she's faking being dead. And he says, as he's having this conversation, "Villainy, I thought to myself, despite all the myths and fairy tales, despite all the stories in books and all the articles in newspapers, is not very mysterious at all. It is a person in a room. And I love that because at the same time that we are emphasizing the threat that Hangfire is, we are minimizing who he is because he's not a myth. He's not a fairy tale. He is very treacherous and he is very scary and he's eluded them. And so he's been this big kind of almost mythological entity to them that they've been chasing this whole time. But at the end of the day, it is a person in a room. It is a man just standing there, and a man can be beaten. So I think that he does this really good job of balancing how real the villainy is while also trying to minimize it. It is something that can be defeated. And then lastly, I want to look at this quote on page 180 because this is something that stood out to me when I first read it, but looking back on it retrospectively hits even harder. So page 180, so literally just one page later, him and Hangfire are still having this conversation, and Hangfire says, "I never forced her. No one can force Ellington Faint to do anything. I just gave her a push in the right direction. A human being is like any other animal, Snicket. If it wants something enough, it will do anything at all." And that is so sinister, considering the reveal that he is Ellington's father. The fact that she has been searching for her dad, who is supposed to be this brilliant naturalist and this really gentle and kind man, the fact that he is the villain and the way that he is treating his own daughter is like any other animal that he studied is horrendous. The implications of that are awful, but it's something that doesn't hit home really until you come to it later. And it's a really interesting quote to begin with, the fact that we get kind of this foreshadowing. Why would he consider a human being like an animal? Maybe a normal person wouldn't, but a naturalist would. And so that was a nice little foreshadowing kind of hint towards that reveal at the end there. But that just gives me chills when we think about it retrospectively, because what an awful thing to say, considering that that's your kid. And it really emphasizes his villainy overall. All right, moving on from quotes, as you can tell, obviously, I really, really loved the writing in this, and I had so many more written down that really stood out to me, but I wanted to highlight those few. Moving on to some other general thoughts about the series. I probably shouldn't have been surprised that this was a tragedy in the end, considering the source material and considering the author, but I was devastated by the end. Seeing Lemony do the right thing and then being scorned by the people he had come to trust because he had to be kind of ruthless about it, that's so upsetting. That's so sad. Because at the end of the day, did he murder someone? Yeah, he murdered Hangfire. Did Hangfire, I don't want to say deserve it, but was this a villain that they were trying to stop who was planning to hurt a lot of other people and who had already killed other people? Yes, but also we have that in conflict with the fact that they are supposed to be noble and good, and the fact that he had promised Ellington to help her find her father, and he does, but he doesn't promise anything after that. And so when we have that reveal that Hangfire is her dad and he just straight up kills him, like pushes him into the mouth of the abominating beast, it's the right thing to do, but also a very difficult and morally gray kind of sticky thing to do. And the fact that he spent so much time recruiting his friends and making them into associates for his organization, and they all believed in the same mission, but for them to turn around and look at him like he was the villain because he tried to do the right thing, horrifying, gut-wrenching, perfectly tragic ending because we've been building to this and all the pieces fit together to make it work out that way, and yet I was still surprised by it and it still broke my heart. And it also gives a lot of insight as to why he was such a loner later on. It emphasizes the tragedy of how doing the right thing and being noble and honest and good doesn't always lead to a happy ending, which was kind of, I don't want to say the point of a series of unfortunate events, but one of the major themes. And so tying that back in here to Snicket's own experiences really works within the story world, but also feels very in character and just feels like a very true but difficult lesson. And it is the tragedy, right, that he is trying against all odds to uphold these ideals that his organization is supposed to uphold, that they are going against, and then the fact that they turn around and exclude him or ostracize him when he does uphold those ideals. It's perfectly tragic. Really should have seen that coming, and yet I didn't, and it made me really sad. I can't stop thinking about the reunion between Kit and Lemony. I wanted to both cheer and to cry, and I feel like I remember a couple of scenes in the original series that felt like this too, where it was a semi-reunion, but you couldn't really rejoice yet. And so there was that moment of just relief of Kit is safe, it's okay, they can see each other, but the fact that they can't acknowledge each other, the fact that he has to walk away from that situation and trust that she's going to carry on and be okay, that she's going to take care of Ellington from that point forward. It is so beautifully done and such a perfect little moment at the end. land that is exactly the right mixture of bitter and sweet to capture the overall bittersweet feeling of the story. And this series in particular has helped me a lot with my own middle grade novel that I'm working on right now. A friend of mine in my writing group recommended that I read the series as I was explaining kind of my concept and my ideas. He recommended that I come back to this one. I had tried to read the first book before a long time ago and never got through it. So I returned to it in hopes that it would inform my own writing. And it has, as far as writing and style and structure goes, but at the same time, it's reminded me that middle grade stories can deal with difficult subjects and they can be heavy. I think I've read a lot of middle grade novels recently trying to prepare for my own work and get inspired for my own work that have felt very fun and lighthearted, and that's great. Obviously there is a great place for that, but the story that I'm working on is not super lighthearted. It is kind of a tragedy in and of itself. Hopefully aiming for a more hopeful ending, but it's meant to be kind of sad overall, and I think I felt maybe a little held back by that, like maybe it wasn't supposed to be a middle grade novel, but this was a very helpful reminder that we can be quirky and fun and have our moments of laughter and be a little bit absurd at times while also really looking at these real world truths and delivering them in a way that doesn't feel sugar-coated, that kids really can handle. This is the kind of stuff that we were reading when we were kids, so I think it was an encouraging reminder that my own work can be a little bit heavy and can be a little bit dark, and that's okay. In fact, it's not only okay, but it's almost better to look the heaviness in the eye and actually wrestle with it than it is to avoid it. Again, not to sugarcoat it. So it was really beautifully done to me as a reader, but also as a writer, it was very encouraging. Finally, I just want to end by saying that overall, I was expecting to really enjoy the series. I've always loved a series of unfortunate events, and I like Snicket as a writer, but I wasn't expecting to love it as much as I did. And I finished it over a week ago now, and I'm still thinking about it on the regular. I am parsing through some of the scenes that I have gone through and considering the way that it's written, and not just for myself as a writer, but just some of the scenes really stuck with me as a person. And so I think I'm pleasantly surprised by how much I loved it. Because again, was expecting to really enjoy it because I love a series of unfortunate events. But yeah, it took me by surprise in the best way possible. All right, I think that's everything I have to say. I could continue to talk about this, but I'm going to stop myself there. Looking ahead, I am in the outlining trenches right now with my own novel, but I can see a light at the end of the tunnel. So I'm hoping that means that I can do not a writing vlog because I haven't really been recording my progress, but a writing update sometime soon and talk about the process that I have gone through to get this book outlined. I am very close to the end, hopefully, or at least I'm close to starting the actual chapter outline, but I think I have a good idea finally of the structure of the overall thing. All this said, also the school year is fast approaching, which means I have to go back to work soon, so hopefully that will mean some more reading vlogs coming up soon as they are a little bit easier and less time consuming to film and edit, so I don't know for what yet, but hopefully that will be on the horizon as well. But overall, that is all from me for now. If you have read the series, I would really love to have a conversation with you about it. I don't know many people who have read it, so I am really itching to be able to talk to someone about it. So if you have anything to add to anything that I've said, or anything that you want to point out, or if you just want to talk about the series because you've loved it too, I would love it if you commented below so we can have a conversation about it. Before I say goodbye, as always, if you like this kind of content and would like to see what else I have in store, you are more than welcome to like and subscribe below. But in the meantime, happy reading, happy writing, and I will chat with you all soon.